are just joining for the first time to a campaigners breakfast. My name's Ren. I'm part of the campaigns team at Sustainable Food Places based at Sustain with Sophia and Vera. We host these campaigners breakfasts each month. We had a break over summer, but we're back now, focusing on different topics that we are working on campaigns around. And it's just an informal session to bring to the table things we're working on and to pose. We usually have people come present, and it's an opportunity to sort of ask questions, learn, share knowledge. Today we are looking at framing sort of the less and better meat argument. We're shortly about to launch our new campaign, Food for the Planet. And one of our key messages within this campaign is more veg, better meat. And as we all know here, it can be quite a difficult narrative to put forward. There's often quite a lot of pushback, whether that's on kind of privilege and eating less and better meat is only for the wealthy, or what are we going to do about farmers' livelihoods, or kind of personal choice. So we are hosting this session to kind of help you with kind of the framing and resources to help push back on those arguments and create quite a positive campaign. So today we're going to be specifically focusing on kind of the affordability argument specifically, and hopefully in the future we'll bring in other topics. We're thinking of doing one on the farmers argument specifically. So we've got a main presentation today from Dr. Courtney Scott from the Food and Farming Countryside Commission, who's been doing some brilliant research on reframing arguments, and specifically around meat. And we're also going to briefly bring in Claire Oxborough, who's done from Friends of the Earth, who have also done some really great campaigning on kind of flipping the narrative to make it a positive way to push for less meat to save the planet. We will also, as part of our kind of campaign resources, we're developing a bit of a Q&A document with kind of typical questions that people ask when they try and push back on the kind of more veg, less meat or better meat argument. And we're kind of asking for your help, really. We've just started framing those questions. I will share a Miro board after the presentations for you to have a look at and make any comments about the questions that we started to pose, and add in any questions that you think would be really useful to have as a resource for when you're kind of launching your own campaigns locally, and what kind of arguments you might have to face. Little bit of admin, if you can stay on mute as during the presentations. If you've got questions, pop them in the chat, but where there will also be opportunities after the presentations to actually ask your questions. You can either put your hand up, or I can come to you if I see your question in the chat. Again, it's also, if you have any experiences personally of campaigning on these kind of issues where you are locally, please do share. It's great to share what we've all experienced, but I will stop waffling on and pass you on to Courtney.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me, and lovely to see some familiar names and faces, and to meet those of you who I haven't met yet. It's great to be with you today. As Ren said, I'm going to present some research that we conducted earlier this year. It was between sort of January and March time that I'm just going to share my screen, that we conducted this research, and we've been sorting through what it means. Hopefully you can see that now. Ren, maybe give me a thumbs up. Cool. So hopefully this will be useful for you. I'm going to talk for hopefully about 15-20 minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions afterwards. So if you do have any questions as I'm going along, definitely note them down, because I'll be happy to answer them at the end. First, I'm just going to give a little bit of an intro into what is framing, because it's sometimes a new concept for people, and it's this idea of how we think about things. So when I say banana, you think yellow. It's like your mind has made a structure, and it's made an association in your mind as to how you think about things. And we can use framing in campaigns, or in messaging, in research, in policy. via the information that we choose to present or not to present, we can spark different images and different ideas in your head based on what you've already come to us with. So in the kind of academic speak, they're called these mental structures, the way that we see the world. They shape the way we see the world, and therefore they shape what we think of as kind of good and bad outcomes. And in policy work, frames are quite important because how we define a problem automatically frames the solutions that can flow from that. So how we define the challenges around meat, for example, what we're talking about today, means that in your head, you're already making assumptions and forming ideas about what the solutions are to that challenge. So it's important how we set out that problem, how we talk about the problem, helps to shift towards where the solutions are going to go. And the kind of reason that we are interested in framing, particularly at FFCC, and a lot of other people and groups are interested in framing, is because when we can reframe public discourse, the way we talk about an issue, we can hopefully change the way that the public sees that particular issue and what counts as kind of common sense in this quote here. Because the type of language we use can activate those frames in your brain and help to build support for particular policy solutions. It's important to say, though, that when we're talking about framing, we're talking about ideas and not slogans. This is not communications. It's about trying to get down into the kind of deep beliefs that people hold, the values that they hold in their mind, and to repeat those frames until it becomes sort of normal discourse. And as I said before, to define the problem in such a way that the solution is also defined. So, of course, communications and fancy language can come into this, but actually it's about touching into those values and those beliefs that we all come with, that we all hold in our everyday lives. There's a lot of issues when we're talking about framing food. These will be familiar to most of you. Things about personal responsibility come up a lot when we're talking about food versus the kind of need for systemic change. And included in this, you'll see a lot is this choice discourse around, well, I have the right to make a choice, or it's individual choice to choose what foods we eat. There's a lot of issues around framing inequalities and disparities, which touches on some of the work that's been done around framing poverty in the UK more generally. There's a lot of challenges around the kind of immediate nature of food. We all eat food every day, 3 times a day, but versus the kind of prevention and long-term aspects of food and the kind of impacts that food can have. So that's a challenge that we need to overcome in framing. There's also competing needs and competing interests in food. I've put one here, but there's loads of examples around citizen needs and desire for citizens to have food that they like and that's affordable and that's convenient to them versus what works for producers or what works for companies to produce that food. And the I'm going to skip over the foods versus nutrients one. I can come back to that if you're interested in it. But there's also this challenge, I think, relevant, particularly into the work that you all are doing in your campaigns around the kind of local aspects of food versus the global aspects of food. And that comes in quite often when we're talking about framing. I just wanted to give one quick example of a reframe so you can kind of see what I'm talking about before I get into this. This comes from some work from Guy's and St. Thomas's Charity and Frameworks Institute, who are looking at childhood obesity and how we can talk about this differently. I think this will be familiar to a lot of you. But just this first one here around caregivers and parents need to start making healthy choices for their children. So that's very much in that individual frame. It's saying it's your responsibility as a parent to make the food choices for your children. It's putting it all on that individual. Whereas the one in the green box is highlighting the role of the system. It's saying families are up against a flood of unhealthy food pouring out from high streets. And so it's putting the responsibility elsewhere, away from the individual. And what this does is it naturally starts to move towards policy and system level solutions instead of me as an individual. I need to change what food I'm eating, what food I'm serving to my kids. So it brings it into a much more productive space for the type of kind of transformative change that we know is needed for a lot of these challenges around food. So our key question was in that same vein. How can we help reframe some food issues to help move away from individual level solutions and towards policy and system level solutions? And we were interested in 3 key topics. As Ren said, one of them is affordability. The other one is meat. And the third one was around just making the general case for change for why food and food systems need to change. What's the issue? What's the problem? What needs to change? I'll talk mostly today about the affordability and the meat ones because they do go hand in hand and they're very relevant campaigns that you'll be running. But I will touch a little bit on that case for change as well. I'm not going to go too much into the methods because I want to spend some time, most of the time, talking about what we found. But we did this through a combination of looking at frames and framing that had been done elsewhere, and testing those kind of reframes with focus groups, and then bringing it out to a poll of about 6,000 people across the UK. So what I'll present to you today is a kind of combination of findings from the focus groups and the polling data. And I have a lot more information on that if you at any point want more information on how we did this or the specific bits that we found. I'm just going to show this from the polling. So this is to show a little bit about how we kind of tested it and also the variations that we tested. So as I said, we had those 3 main topics, and within that we were testing particular frames or particular values in particular ideas. So the first one, under case for change, we looked at 2 main frames, one being power, so talking about who has the power to change the food system, and the other one being legacy, which is about tapping into our desire to build a better future for our children. On affordability, we were looking at frames that talked about the need to kind of realign the whole system so it's fair for everybody. And within that, we brought in either a power frame, again, who has the power to do that, who has the power to make that system function better, and one around acting more locally and the kind of role that local food can play in that system realignment. Around meat, we had tested a lot of different frames in the focus groups around meat, and as I'll present to you, unfortunately, none of them worked. So we picked the best of the bunch to go to the polling, which was around this idea of the culture of meat eating and how meat plays an important part in our diet, but how we can start to shift that so we focus on the pleasure and the enjoyment and the kind of cultural significance of meat rather than eating it all the time in every meal. You'll also see in this column here that we tested different variations on responsibility. So either explicitly saying the government is responsible for solving this problem, or leaving it open, not saying who's responsible for solving this problem. And again, this comes back to the fact that we were trying to see if we could shift people towards policy solutions. So that's the main focus of this. Now, if you were looking to shift towards other type of solutions, you could put in a different type of responsibility or a different actor who's responsible. But that's what we were testing in this work. So some of the key findings. There were some of these frames that were quite powerful and that worked very well. And the helpful language was typically around this idea of system realignment. People in the focus groups in particularly really latched onto that language and started using it themselves and saying, well, the system needs to work better. And, the whole system needs to be realigned. They would actually use that word, which suggests that they had taken it in and were actually able to use it within their own mental frames to describe a problem and therefore a solution. Affordability was hugely important, and I will talk about that more in the next few slides. Power also resonated really strongly with people. So talking about powerful food actors in the food system, and we were talking about companies. I'll show you the frame in a minute, but you could, that's just, it's again, a way of reminding people that there are people in the system who have the power to change it, and it's not all up to you. and the system can function differently. And talking about those powerful actors seemed to really help spark that shift towards the system. And likewise, assigning responsibility. So saying explicitly, this is a problem that government and policy can solve, really seemed to help move people into that policy space. Things that were unhelpful. We tested a couple of frames which were just trying to, this was more around the case for change, but just trying to explain the problem and the solution. And that didn't really seem to change much. I think this is something Claire will talk about in her presentation about facts, and those not really working to change opinion, which this research also shows. But when we added some kind of solution language or responsibility language to those facts, then we started to see a shift in support for policy solutions. And the culture frame that we tested around meat worked sometimes and didn't work other times. And I'll get into that because that's kind of main thing that I'll be talking about with you today. So I'll just leave that there for now. And I just wanted to present these two examples here. The first quote is somebody reacting to a frame that didn't have responsibility in it. So it just was talking about the problem. And they're saying, well, it scares me, but I don't really know what I can do about it. And that feels quite discouraging. And then the kind of opposite of that being when we ascribed responsibility, and somebody was, quite a lot of people then started saying, oh yeah, it is the responsibility of the government to do this. And it felt much more like they were able to engage with that as a topic. So just wanted to present those two contrasting examples there. So on affordability, I'm going to talk mostly about affordability and meat today because they were the ones that are the most connected. Affordability came up in every single focus group we ran, even when we weren't talking about affordability or trying to frame affordability within that focus group. And it came up for all different topics when we were talking about the environment, when we were talking about meat, when we were talking about health, when we were talking about individual choice, when we were talking about government responsibility. Affordability was there. It was like the elephant in the room always, except for in the focus groups where we were deliberately trying to frame affordability. And then we really seemed to get somewhere. It was as if because we had taken that concern off the table and we had put it front and center, it actually allowed the kind of mind to focus on the other bits of the problem. And we started to see a lot more productive conversations around it. And in the framing, in the polling, the affordability frame that talked about power was the most successful frame across the board. And it increased support for policies that arguably had nothing to do with the frame that we presented. So we presented the frames and then we asked the same questions to everybody, but they only saw one frame. And the people who saw this affordability power frame were well up for supporting policies on the environment, policies on meat. Now, the frame doesn't talk about those. It doesn't talk about anything on them. But because we framed it in such a way, it seemed to be opening up again support for those different policy topics. Now, this isn't to say that affordability is like the magic solution to everything, because there are issues and it comes up. And I think it has to do with this kind of fairness value. So this quote here is really showing that, it's okay for some people, but, affordability is really about fairness. And so those two were quite linked in people's minds. And that fairness value comes through quite strongly in some of the frames that were very successful. And so I'll talk about that a lot when we come back to meat, because I actually think that's something that could be applied really nicely to a less and better meat campaign. So just to show you that affordability frame, so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. This is the one that was most successful in the polling. And it brings in a power frame, but it also has the value around fairness. So that first line is saying, this isn't fair. This whole situation isn't fair. The second line there is saying, there are powerful people who could change this and who could make it more fair. And then at the end, it says, and it's the government's responsibility to make sure that that change is happening. So it's got all three of those elements in it. It's got the kind of values around fairness. It's got the power. It's saying that there are people in power who can make these changes, and then it's ascribing responsibility. And those three things together seem to be the trifecta that really helps make some of these statements more effective than others. Just to give you an example of how this worked in practice, in the focus groups, we had a bit of the discussion that was unframed. We didn't introduce any frames. We just wanted to talk to people about food and hear their views. And this is the same person. So this person was saying, well, I try and eat healthy. Yeah, I go to the supermarket. I try and be a little bit more healthy than I was a few years ago. It was very talking about themselves, very individual. And then we introduced some of these frames. And this was in reaction to the frame that you just saw. And this person starts talking about, well, oh yeah, this is about, chasing profit. It starts to become about those people in power and the companies in power. And it takes the government to change that. And, oh, that's a very good idea to focus on subsidizing fruits and vegetables. It gets into a very different space. It's talking about the system. It feels much more natural to talk about the system. And that's just one example of many of what happened when we introduced these frames. I'm going to skip the next slide on responsibility and skip right ahead to meat. The meat frames in the focus groups didn't really shift support towards policy solutions. Meat feels like one of those issues that's very close to people's hearts. It has a quite significant role in our diets, and it feels really individual when we start talking about it. Except for when we started talking about government responsibility, when we were explicitly talking about that, then we started to see a little bit of a shift towards supporting policy solutions around meat. The frames spoke about meat production, not meat consumption. And that was, we didn't test the alternative, so I can't say for sure, but that was perhaps helpful in avoiding some of the kind of silos that the meat debate tends to get into, and helped to avoid some of that individual reaction, individual response. But some of the frames, the ones that we didn't test in the polling, sparked a sort of British exceptionalism. And this had to do with particularly around environmentalism and also around intensive meat farming. And saying, well, I know intensive meat farming is a problem. I know it causes problems in the environment. I know it causes problems for health. But that's not really a problem here. We don't really have intensive meat farming here in the UK. And so in that sense, the frames we tested were backfiring on us. And we're like, that's not helpful. Let's park that one to the side. And what seemed to be causing that was, again, that just providing information without providing the values and without providing the responsibility. When you just provided the information, it was sort of like, oh yeah, well, I know that's a problem, but it's not a problem here. And as I said before, the meat culture frame, which was about, eating meat for the pleasure of it and eating meat for the cultural reasons of it and not eating it all the time, and that becoming part of our British culture. It sometimes worked and it sometimes didn't work. And arguably it didn't work on the things that we wanted it to work on. So that's a bit disappointing. And I'll reflect on that in the next couple of slides. But what I wanted to focus on here was how hand in hand meat and affordability went together. When we talked about meat, affordability came up really strongly. And it was quite often to do with this fairness value that people aren't really in the position to be buying better meat. It's not affordable for people, and that's not really fair. I'm going to skip the next slide. But what happened was, and there's the culture frame. Sorry, I knew it was in there somewhere. So you can see the text of it. What happened was, with this culture frame, it did shift people a little bit into a space where it was a different discussion then. It was less about, I should eat meat, I shouldn't eat meat. It was more about, where is the role of meat in our diet? So that was productive. And it became even more productive when we started introducing this line here. I don't know if it shows up when I highlight on it. But this line at the bottom about the government's responsibility. So it's kind of saying, yes, we need to shift our culture, but that culture is being driven by other factors outside of ourselves, and reminding people of that. And I'm going to come back to affordability because I think that's actually the key to unlocking some support, even for a frame like this around meat culture. So in the polling, that meat culture frame didn't shift views on the statement that we need to eat less meat, which is arguably its central goal. So in that sense, it kind of failed. But the frames didn't also work on many other topics. So it was a bit of a kind of hit or miss. But what was interesting was the affordability frame and the case for change frame that brought in power increased support for policies to reduce meat and ready meals. Now, those frames didn't talk about meat. They didn't mention meat. They didn't bring it in as an argument. Meat wasn't in there at all. And yet, just by introducing that frame, we increased support for a policy that is arguably quite contentious around, touching some of our favorite foods in our ready meals and reducing meat in those. The other one that worked is, as I said before, when we introduced that government responsibility line to the culture frame, it did then increase support for policies to reduce the production, the impact of food production on the environment. So again, it started to get into a little bit into that space. But just reflecting on that, it's not surprising that we sometimes get a negative reaction to meat-related policies and meat-related campaigns, especially if price increases would be involved, given how the meat frames tested in our focus groups and in our polling. This has played out in previous research, and I think Claire will talk about a little bit about their experience as well. And I think this is really clearly highlighted when we start talking about meat tax, which came up around the time of the National Food Strategy, although of course it wasn't in there in the end. But the meat tax debate just sort of reeks of unfairness, especially in the way it's currently being framed by a large portion of the media. The framing value was hugely important in this framing research, and also fairness is, previous research has shown that perception of fairness is actually more important for citizens than the effectiveness of the policy. So I think potential reframes around meat have to do with focusing on this, the whole system needing to function differently so it's fair for everybody, so that the relative cost of food, so that higher quality meat becomes more affordable and the system can work better for all of us. I think that's really a place where we could start to see some changes. Now that's something that I'd love to test next time around. But I do think, based on what we've seen and based on previous research, that bringing in a fairness value and bringing in the whole kind of system and affordability arguments, I think is a place that that's where I would go to test next. It seems like the most promising direction for this. So my overarching takeaway from this research, and then I'll open it up for questions. I was really surprised, and I think this will be encouraging for you as you're planning your campaigns, that the people we spoke to, and also in the polling, people are up for change, and even around some of these really tricky topics around meat. And they're up for governments and businesses being really brave and bold because they think it's the fair thing to do and they think it's the right thing to do. But in order to get them into that mind space, we do need to address affordability and also not shy away from discussions of power. It can be quite scary to talk about power in the food system because these are big, powerful actors that we're then talking about. But it does seem important for how we are engaging in this topic and who is responsible for making that change and moving away from an individual lens on the whole food issue. So I will leave it there. There might be some questions. You're welcome to contact me afterwards if you want more information. But look forward to hearing your questions and reflections, and also to hearing discussion later on in this session.
Thanks, Courtney. That was so interesting and really relevant to kind of framing local campaigns, I think. There was a little clarification question from Emily about whether these findings in tested focus groups were in relation to sustainable eating more generally or just meat. And I think it was sustainable meat eating more generally, right? Rather than just...
It was just general meat. It was meat in general. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I'm going to use my chair's privilege to ask the first question, and then I'll move on to Vera. I wanted to, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on the idea of, it's so great to hear that there's the real understanding that there's a need for kind of systems change and responsibility for there to be better policies in place. With your research groups, your focus groups, did it come up, was there, I'm concerned about a general apathy, if it's like, oh, the whole system has changed, it's the government's responsibility, therefore I'm powerless, or we're powerless. What did you experience that, and how would you respond to that suggestion of powerlessness?
I'd actually say it was the opposite. I think people came in with an understanding of feeling powerless to change things. I'm just a passive recipient to this system that is providing food for me, and I have no say in changing it. Now, we didn't get into their individual role in it, but talking about government and about policy and about powerful actors then made them think, oh yeah, I can't do anything about it, not right now, but there are people who can, and those are the people who need to take action. And so it actually seemed to release some of that powerlessness and put the responsibility onto other people. Now that didn't take away their own individual agency. Quite a lot of people then were talking about things like, well, when I go into the supermarket to buy meat, I have no way of knowing if I'm buying higher quality meat. It's not labeled. There's no information there for me. Government and supermarkets really need to do something about that to make my job easier. So it didn't take them out of the equation. It just put the initial impetus on other actors within the system. But I'd say it was actually beneficial in kind of getting away from some of that feeling of powerlessness.
Interesting. That's really useful and interesting to hear. I'm going to pass on to Vera to ask a question, and then to Emily. Vera, are you okay to unmute?
I know. Hi, sorry, I'm in the middle of changing a nappy. Yeah, no, I think
multitasking. Wow.
I mean, it's just so interesting. I didn't want to miss it. But yeah, I think you've kind of touched on it, that people were kind of were really resistant to the idea of taxation, because obviously it does play into this kind of the affordability divide that's already quite big. But it's interesting because I'm just trying to think like what would rebalance the system, to make more sustainable food more affordable is actually ultimately it's internalizing the cost, isn't it, of unsustainable practices. So I'm just wondering actually if I'm going to change my question. Did this notion of fairness, if we have a cheap food system that people are reliant on, it's actually in a way they're relying on it because all other elements of our lives have become more expensive because food is cheap, or we've made food cheaper so that other things can remain expensive. I wonder if that kind of stuff came up, because it's not really whether it's cheap or not, it's whether you have enough money to spend on the kind of food that we all deserve. Did that come up at all, like maybe around housing and other aspects of our lives?
It came up a little bit from some people. I wouldn't say the connection was immediately made for a lot of people between the cost and the what they can afford for food and other things that they're paying for in their lives. So that is something that I think could be worked on. But on the meat tax and the kind of shifting the system and reframing that, I do think, I think this research isn't necessarily ruling out a meat tax, but is saying that if you want to talk about a meat tax, you have to frame it first. You can't just introduce it cold, because then it will spark this unfairness kind of feeling and reaction. And so I think the kind of framing it as it's not right that this, getting into that language first and talking about how the system can function differently first before you start talking about policies which might increase price on some products, I think could be really helpful. It's not going to solve, the whole thing. People will still react to the idea of prices going up, but at least it starts to position it into a different space. But people talked a little bit about other costs and other factors which make food unaffordable, but it wasn't something we were probing on specifically, so it didn't come up a huge amount.
Thanks, Courtney. Can I pass on to Emily to ask a question? Are you okay to unmute, Emily?
Oh yeah, thanks, Ren. Yeah, it was just a really quick question, really. It was just about, obviously, working at a local level. We often, we have quite a lot of discussions with our residents, and there's quite often solutions are outside our hands. They're things that government could do or should do. And I think, absolutely agree with, the message that, and it's really helpful to hear how well you've explored this and articulated it, that actually if you put in the context of government changing things, then that helps people to move forward and some messages. But I just wondered how that actually, if you've got any suggestions about how that could translate for those of us working at a local level, because we tend to try and look at the stuff we can influence, and slightly limit the stuff that's about lobbying government to do X, Y, and Z, because government in their wisdom still don't quite listen to everything we say. Thank you.
Yeah, that definitely came up, and it was often a sort of, we tried to make the focus groups politically representative, and but I didn't look at the political views of people before the focus group. I didn't want to have that in my mind, but often you could tell by the reaction that people had to this government responsibility frames, and people were just like, yeah, but the government's not going to do anything about that. It was quite funny. But I think about the kind of local side of things. The other frame I didn't talk about too much was about affordability and local, and that talked a little bit about kind of how in this weird and crazy food system we have, it can be logical that something flown halfway across the world is less expensive than something grown down the road, and how we can work locally to start to try and change some of that. And I think to your point about local action, I'd say actually the takeaway bit was less that government needs to do it, and it could be government at any level. It was more about ascribing responsibility away from the individual. So whether that be we as a community can change this, or we as our local government can do something about this issue, and this is what we could do. It's more about that shifting away from you making an individual food choice when you go to the supermarket or whatever, and saying who has the power to change what, and being very clear about that. And I think that could translate really well to local government, because it does feel quite challenging, especially at the moment, to think about government taking some of these big and bold actions. And that's something we might work on next, is how we frame these messages for government audiences. But at a sort of local level, I think talking about what can be done locally and who's responsible for making those changes and the impact that can have, I think is in the same kind of vein. It's still ascribing responsibility, and that seemed to be something that was very important. I don't know if that answers it. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Courtney. Very useful for framing for government voices too. I'm going to bring in Claire Oxborough, because I think it'll be really interesting to hear about her campaign at Friends of the Earth, but also I think Claire will have some good reflections on the other questions coming in. Before I do that though, I'm just going to drop a Miro board in the chat for you to just have a look at some of the questions that we've started to pose for our kind of Q&A on the website. I've kind of put some little, if you haven't used Miro before, your mouse scroll can kind of scroll in and out from the board, or on the bottom right hand corner, you can kind of go in or out, and you can drag your mouse to different sections of the board. So I put in some different questions that we've started to pose, and then around them some sticky notes of the colour associated with that question. And it'd be really great for you to just have a read of those questions and kind of any reflections, whether kind of on the question itself or what should be included in the answer. On the left hand side of the board, there's also a kind of a blue box where it'd be great for you to kind of pop in some questions that you think would be relevant to put on the website as a useful resource. And I think Courtney's reframing of these messages is actually really relevant to these questions, so it might change how we ask and answer them. But I'm also now going to pass on to Claire, who's from Friends of the Earth, who's going to share for a couple of minutes what they've been up to in terms of framing the less and better meat argument.
Thanks very much, Ren. And yeah, really interesting to hear from Courtney. It's so much in there that I'd love to kind of dig deeper into, but I'll just share a little bit from Friends of the Earth's campaigning around this issue. Obviously, I also am part of Eating Better, which is a Sustainable Diets Alliance. I'm on the board of Eating Better, and Eating Better member organisations are also doing a lot in this space. So this is just a couple of examples really to highlight some of the issues from our campaigns. And I think I just wanted to also quickly reflect on that kind of system versus individual issue that's come up in the discussion so far. Because when we started talking about the impacts of livestock on the environment back in the sort of 2000s, 2005, 6, 7, we couldn't talk about eating meat as a personal issue. People just did not, every time it was mentioned, it would blow up in the media, and you couldn't get past that in terms of any kind of public discourse. I think that has changed. We still see that kind of polarization in the media of the sort of, the vegan agenda on the one side and the sort of livestock farmers on the other. But I think we have moved on. Sorry, I've just gone forward. So I just wanted to, so this report we produced was in 2009, which we did together with Compassion and World Farming. And so this was a real look at the global picture, and could we feed the world sustainably, humanely, so without factory farming, in a way that didn't trash forests, and still give people nutritious diets. And what it found was, yes, you can, and obviously there's been lots of research on this since, but you do have to significantly cut down the amount of meat that's being produced globally, and share it out a bit more equally as well. So eating less in developed countries, and allowing for slightly more in developing countries. But what we didn't want to do was come out with a report that said we've got to cut back meat consumption globally by, whatever it was, 50%, 80%, because that would have played into the kind of narrative that was already booming in the media around, these environmentalists just telling us to give up meat and we don't want it, and all the rest of it. So our very clever comms person called Nikki Stocks, who went on to work for the Frameworks Institute, which Courtney talked about earlier, she had this idea to completely flip this around and actually say, we can eat meat and save the planet, and we don't need to go veggie to feed a booming population. And it said the same thing. We didn't hide the findings of the report. So these are just some excerpts from the press release we put out. But we said, we reveal that we can still enjoy meat several times a week while feeding the world using planet-friendly and humane farming methods, etc. So it was really interesting how that played out, because I remember doing an interview with the NFU, probably for the farming programme. And normally that kind of interview would have been really, really difficult, and we would have been on opposite sides, and it would be that polarization again. But in fact, what we had is, because we framed it in this way, we actually had a really good discussion about, okay, so we can continue to eat meat, but what does that need to look like, and what do production systems need to look like, and how can we pay farmers fairly? And so the discussion was so much more productive, just by sort of reframing the conversation. And although that was 12 years ago now, which I can't quite believe, but I think it still has relevance for today, because although, as I said, I think we have moved on, we have so much more evidence now from whether it's Committee on Climate Change, IPCC, that we need to change the amount of meat we're eating and producing globally. I think we still get into this rut around the kind of polarized debate in the media, which is really, really unhelpful for moving forward when it comes to kind of talking about solutions. And then the other example I just wanted to share was from a campaign we ran called Meat Free May, which we ran for 3 years. And it's just to show, we tested lots and lots of different messages out, mostly through our sort of Facebook adverts. And we could just test quite easily, you know, how many people engaged with the different images and messages that we used. And so the first one we tried was this one, which was around the impact. So if you eat veg this May, help save the environment, you can save 17 animals by doing it. So that had, you know, a certain amount of success. We then got about double the amount of engagement with this one, which was more about the challenge, but framing it in a really fun way. So using a really fun, kind of slightly silly image with posing a bit of a challenge. And that had, as I say, about 2 times the engagement of the previous one. And then the third one, we looked at the kind of taste sort of framing in a way. So, and that had sort of 3 times the engagement. So this was all about, it's the tastiest challenge, really playing on that kind of, you know, experience something new and you can help the environment at the same time. And I think those examples just give you kind of some idea of, you know, what kinds of things can work. But we've done so much more, which I can't go into now, and obviously with Eating Better as well, but also drawing out some of the things Courtney talked about and just trying to summarize what does and doesn't work in terms of campaign messaging and communications, is that definitely just relying on the facts doesn't work. You kind of think, you know, if only people knew, they would change, but they don't, because as we know, food is just so much more complicated than that, and it's so personal. Guilt doesn't tend to work. It can work for a minority that are motivated by, you know, deep, you know, feelings of empathy towards animals and so on, but for the vast majority, it doesn't tend to work, and people shut down from engaging. Focusing on what's gained and not what's lost. So I think with even, you know, less and better meat, the less is problematic. How do we kind of change the way we're talking about that? So it's about, you know, gaining taste, gaining new kind of experiences for people. And WRI have done some really interesting work around this in their Better Buying Lab work. So this was specifically looking at what people respond to in terms of cafes and the way food is marketed to people, and really finding that highlighting things like taste and the pleasure and almost this indulgent language works really, really well, rather than the sort of restrictive language around loss and meat-free, and even vegetarian and vegan labeling doesn't work very well. Using appealing food images always works, and having a bit of fun with messaging. And then the wider benefits to the environment and animal welfare and health can then reinforce that. But we've tend to found that going really strong on those environmental messages up front don't work as well as having them a little bit more in the background. And then this was just a picture about, this polarization problem. And I think, you know, we have got it in Eating Better. I think we've got it right in terms of the less and better concept. And when you have a chance to talk to people about it, people do get it. It is positive, it's achievable, it's not exclusive. We're not telling people to go vegan. It can be holistic, we can support sustainable farming, lots of wins around health, environment, welfare, but we still need to do more work around the language and the comms to really make it work for people. And I think that, taking on what Courtney was saying around the affordability and fairness, I think is really interesting, is how that could be built in a bit more strongly into the kind of less and better meat framing. But that was all I wanted to say, but really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks so much for that, Claire. It's you can see how that positive framing can have a bigger impact rather than just telling people off. Courtney, I wondered if you had any reflections kind of looking at that framing and your research with working with focus groups, if you had any kind of comments or reflections on these methods.
Yeah, sorry, that cut out a little bit. I don't know if it's my end or yours, but I think I think what's really interesting is to reflect upon the less and better arguments, and how that does, it is something that people can get their head around, but how we can make it even stronger. And I think thinking about the kind of making the system work better for everybody, and the fairness angle is something that could really complement that. So in order for us to be able to eat less and better meat, and for everybody to be able to do that, the whole system is going to function differently. And I think what's interesting about that is it's quite hard for people to think, and us included, to think about how the system could work differently, because we can't see it. We're in the system we're currently in, and in the system we're currently in, the better meat is much more expensive for a lot of people. And so kind of painting that picture really visually, and really, using all your senses and your taste and your smell and everything, just to get people into that space of this can be different. And if we did this at scale, it would be different, and it would be fairer for everybody. I think that could be something to reflect on and think about how campaigns, particularly at the local level, because you engage with people so much more directly, to see how that plays out. When we start painting a picture of the different system that's possible, and making that really real for people, and how it could be fairer and work towards improving affordability, that might be something that's worth reflecting on in your work as you go through your campaign, in terms of how people are responding to your messaging. Yeah, that's what I was thinking as you were talking, Claire.
The values-based arguments feels really important. There's a quick clarification from Kemi about definition of better meat. I don't know if this is a sort of question for you, Sophia, perhaps, or can bring in Claire or Courtney.
Yeah, I can answer that. So we follow the frame set by Eating Better, and there was also a question about who is eating better. So it's an alliance of organizations all working on less and better meat. And the frame for better meat set by that alliance, and Friends of the Earth are our members, Sustain are members of that alliance, is a frame where we progressively move towards better and best. And better is slightly more than the current standards we have in the UK. We're talking about higher welfare, indoor production, such as our SPCA assured, and moving a step forward. So it's like a ladder with several steps, and at the bottom we have red tractor, what is standards of production in the UK, and we step one step on that ladder towards better, and best standards are what we associate with organic standards of production. And there is actually a guide, a very detailed guide for retailers and caterers, which Claire has put on the chat already. Otherwise I was going to put there. I hope that answers the question.
Fantastic, thank you for that, Sophia. We have about 5 minutes left. I was wondering if anyone had any reflections on their own experiences with them pushing the kind of better meat, more veg argument in their local areas, or if they've had any kind of reflections on how they might push back after seeing presentations from Courtney and Claire. If not, I think it'd be also great to bring in Natasha. Oh, sorry, Peter. Peter Samson, do you want to come in and kind of give some reflections?
Okay, fair enough. Camera, yes. There's an awful lot to think about here, and I think if we're wanting these campaigns to work well, in a roundabout way, we all need to become better at our communication, because I think that's what's underlying all of this. It's the words and the images that seem to matter more than almost anything else. I'm not a communication expert, and the organisation that I work for really doesn't have a trained comms person either. So I think we might collectively need to have a bank of stuff to draw on to be able to make this work better than we do at the moment.
Definitely. I think it's yeah, I think it's particularly when with, I mean, there was some talk in the chat about kind of the power of supermarkets and shareholders of supermarkets, and also the power of communication that those big corporations have. That is what we're up against. So I think it's really important that we can find clever ways to push back. I think, unless anybody's got any final reflections, it might be nice to finish a couple of minutes early, as I know we've all got meeting mania in our weeks. Thank you so much to Courtney and Claire. They were absolutely amazing presentations, really, really insightful. If anybody wants to get in touch with Claire or Courtney, I'm sure they wouldn't mind you reaching out. Sophia, is anything I've missed that need to share? I guess we want to share about when what the new Food for the Planet website is hopefully going to be ready in the next few weeks. So watch this space. Sophia, have you got any final comments or reflections?
No, just thanking Claire and Courtney again for sharing very interesting presentations and also learnings from years of campaigning, Claire. We're still relatively new in this space, but it's good to know we won't be the first and certainly not the last. And also, I would like to finish on a positive note, because while we know the discussion is still polarized, you know, we have so much more evidence today to support future campaigning. And I would like to end on that positive note, and that we can learn from so many others in this space, including the Eating Better Alliance that Sustain is a member of. I think that will help us to build a strong campaign. And also, if there's lots of members of Sustainable Food Places campaigning at the local level, I think that will strengthen you know, our policy asks at the national level, and that shouldn't be underestimated. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And as Ren said, we would like to do one of these sessions specifically on farmers in the future, because we cannot forget that, you know, not all farmers are the same, and some are very supportive of this agenda. So if you have any ideas for a future session on planet-friendly diets and impact on farmers, let us know. We'll be working on it.
Brilliant. Thank you all. We'll let you know about the next campaigners breakfast on the Rise Up and through email. Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Courtney, that was so interesting. Thank you so much for all those insights. Mega
welcome.
work.
I wanted to say that if you want me